Chapter 29, The Dark Cabin. And the word ladder is dark, bark, bank, band, bond, bold, cold. As she neared the top of the slope, Elizabeth saw before her, in a clearing rimmed with a stand of aspen, the small cabin. Its roof was laden with snow, but the path up to the doorway was cleared, as though someone had recently visited. The windows were unbroken and the door looked sturdy, but something about the cabin made it appear abandoned. She moved closer and stood, examining it for a good long while. With the thin white trees all around and the moon glowing above, everything seemed clear and vivid. But Elizabeth also felt that a very strange quiet had come over the night. "Come on back," Freddie called. His voice died away quickly in the stillness. "Just give me a minute," Elizabeth yelled. She stood, examining the cabin, wondering if it might be the one she'd read about in Marshall Fall's journal, the one Norbridge's father had built for Gracella. If it was, it didn't appear to have aged much at all over the many years it had been standing. "I think this cabin belonged to Norbridge's sister," she said, talking more to herself than to Freddie. "What did you say?" Freddie called. "This cabin belonged to Gracella," Elizabeth yelled. And then for some reason she didn't understand, she called out the name twice more. "Gracella! Gracella!" A tiny creak echoed from within the cabin. Elizabeth stood perfectly still and listened for a long moment, but heard nothing more. She moved a step closer and peered through the panes of one of the windows. A small flare of crimson light flickered inside the cabin as another creak sounded. "You okay?" Freddie called. Elizabeth felt a jolt of fear in her stomach, and she backed away from the cabin and began rushing back to Freddie, running down the small hill. "I'm fine," she yelled. "What in the world made you yell out her name like that?" Freddie said as Elizabeth drew near. "Not sure, I just blurted it out." "Is everything all right up there?" "Everything's fine," Elizabeth said. She reached Freddie and looked back as she clipped her skis on. A crimson light glowed steadily behind the windows of the cabin as though someone had lit a candle inside. "Oh, Tucker. Sorry, my cat Tucker. If it's not my kids, it's an animal. Everybody wants to be where the reading is happening." "Did something happen?" Freddie said. He looked to the cabin. "Hey, what's that? Was someone in there?" "I don't know," Elizabeth said. Although she'd only come a short distance, she felt out of breath and her heart was pounding. "I think I heard something." A loud noise, like a box toppling over and slamming onto the floor, sounded from the cabin. "Let's get out of here," Freddie said. Elizabeth felt on the verge of panic, but she realized that she didn't want to go any farther away from Winterhouse than she already had. "Let's go back the way we came." She began to ski, and Freddie followed her in silent agreement. A louder booming noise came from the cabin. When the trail curved 100 feet ahead, Elizabeth looked back. The entire clearing itself, where the cabin stood, was now bathed in a reddish light. "Hurry!" Elizabeth called to Freddie, and the two of them began gliding along the trails as quickly as they could. They raced ahead for 5 minutes at top speed, and then Elizabeth was panting so hard and her chest was heaving so heavily that she had to stop for a moment's rest. "That is tiring," Freddie said with a heavy exhalation. They stood at a point on the trail right beside the edge of the frozen lake, along a stretch where they could see behind them on the trail for several hundred feet. "Very tiring," Elizabeth said, trying to catch her breath. She looked back. There, just where the trail curled into sight from the bend far behind them, at the end of a dark line of trees, was a faint ball of light coming into view. "What's that?" Freddie said. Elizabeth suddenly felt even more panicked than when she'd been standing in front of the cabin. "Maybe one of the other skiers is coming back," she said without conviction. She thought of the light that escaped from the Winterhouse library on Christmas Eve, and she thought of what she'd read about Gracella's cabin. Most of all, she wondered what had compelled her to repeat Gracella's name 3 times in the snowy clearing. "With a red light?" Freddie said. "I don't remember." "Come on," Elizabeth said before he could finish, and she began digging into the snow with her poles as she got her skis gliding. Freddie followed instantly, and they were back cruising across the snow as quickly as they could. They moved furiously along the icy trail, their lanterns illuminating the way, the moon hovering high above. Elizabeth's chest began to ache from the cold air and her exhaustion, but she kept pressing her arms and her legs forward, too afraid to look behind her. or to stop. So that's a picture of Freddie and Elizabeth. Ouch! Freddie cried out, and Elizabeth skidded to a halt and turned to see that he had taken a tumble. Far behind him, but closer now that the last time they'd stopped, was the crimson light, brighter and moving steadily toward them. "Get up!" Elizabeth yelled. "We need to get out of here." Freddie scrambled to his feet, took one look behind him, and gave out a yelp before beginning to ski once again. Elizabeth began to glide too, scanning ahead of her for the lights of Winterhouse. All she could hear was the throbbing of her own breath and the swishing of her skis. She looked behind her and saw the crimson light had grown bigger. Whoever was following them had cut the distance to a couple of 100 feet and was gaining steadily. Elizabeth dug in even harder, pressed her skis into the snow, and kicked away again and again, hoping Freddie was able to keep up. "There it is," she called when they rounded a cluster of trees and saw the brightly lit yellow walls of Winterhouse in the distance. "Let's go." She stopped and looked back. The crimson light was at most 100 feet behind them. "You go on," Freddie huffed, leaning over. "I have to rest." "We can't, Freddie. We can't. It's coming. Come now." He looked back and then stood up and began to pump forward once more. They continued, and more quickly than Elizabeth would have thought, Winterhouse came fully into view, its lights blazing in the sky. The two children glided out of the last cluster of trees and into the enormous open space at the fringe of Winterhouse, then passed over a bridge, the very one she'd seen Marcus and Selina Hymes inspecting the day before, and glided up into the shadow of the great hotel itself. They stopped and looked back. The crimson light was at the other side of the bridge and had halted as if unable to pursue them any farther. "Elizabeth!" someone called, and she looked to Winterhouse. Norbridge was running out to them. "Here, Norbridge," she called. "We're here. Is everything all right?" he said as he came up to them. "Where is everyone else?" "We're all right," Elizabeth said, panting heavily. "Something was chasing us," she pointed to the bridge, but the light had disappeared. "It was right behind us," Freddie said. "Something was coming after us. It was like a red light." Norbridge peered into the darkness in the direction that the two children were looking. He stood in silence, scanning the moonlight. "I'll send some of the crew out to make sure the others come back safely," Norbridge said. "Our ski patrol team sometimes goes out at night. That's probably what you saw. You two get inside and wait for me." Elizabeth nodded. "Come on," she said to Freddie, and they headed for the rear entrance. Before they came to it, though, Elizabeth felt a strange sensation come over her. She looked up, and on the second floor, illuminated by one of the tall outside lampposts, Marcus and Selina Hymes were at a window peering into the darkness beyond the small bridge across the creek. "What is it?" Freddie said. Elizabeth pointed up, and Freddie looked to the window. Marcus and Selina noticed the children staring at them. Selina glared at Elizabeth, and the curtain snapped closed. Freddie's mouth fell open as he turned to Elizabeth. She continued to stare upward. "I think somehow I woke up." Gracella Winters. Chapter 30. A Dire Disappearance.